Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Bob Nightengale. Bob is a national baseball columnist at USA Today. In this episode, I chat with Bob about baseball returning amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as his journalism career. Graduating at Arizona State University to covering Bo Jackson and reporting live at the 2001 World Series after 9/11 and the Chicago Cubs breaking a 100-year curse to win the 2016 World Series. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is not only available on YouTube, but also podcasts. So not only subscribe to my channel at the bottom right hand of your screen, but like, rate, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This is episode 16 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Bob Nightengale. He is a USA Today baseball columnist, an MLB Network insider, and the Arizona chapter chairman of the Baseball Writers Association of America. Bob, thank you so much for joining me on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. My pleasure, Lucas.
And Bob, we're going to get into your career, but I just wanted to start off with sort of the news of the day. And one of that, of course, is the MLB's proposal for health and safety protocols. And I'm just curious your thoughts on some of the highlights of these. I know that when we're recording this episode, the Bundesliga in Europe just restarted and they had their own health and safety protocols. And I know that for many fans, you know, when baseball comes back, having health and safety is very important.
Yeah, some of these protocols are, just like everyday walk of life. You know, they don't want anybody to, shake hands, touch anybody, hug anybody. So in baseball's case, no high fives, no low fives. They want social distancing in the dugout. We'll see how it works. The pitchers be quarantined by themselves. And, then after games, they advise, hey, take your showers back at your house or the team hotel. You're on the road, don't want you to use Uber or Lyft, that sort of thing. So, yeah, we'll see what happens. But, yeah, if you want to play baseball, you've got to take some severe measures.
No doubt. And I know we talked briefly, before we came on air, certainly a lot of my listeners are from Toronto and with the Blue Jays, it's certainly a lot of uncertainty where they're going to play because of the travel restrictions. Nothing set in stone yet, Bob, but I mean, for you, do you think that, maybe starting their season in Dunedin would make the most sense, just given, that's where they do spring training and, they wouldn't have to deal with any of the travel restrictions coming back into Canada?
Yeah, well, either that. I was thinking more, Lucas, they could, play, share the complex for Detroit Tigers, play home games in Detroit, that sort of thing. In New York if you want to, but Detroit would make a lot of sense to me. Do it that way, rather than go all the way to Dunedin. At least if you're, somewhere like Detroit, you can bounce, back and forth, that sort of thing. So we'll see. Push comes to shove, they could play games in Dunedin. But I think they want these games in major league ballparks. So all the way to Florida, you might as well have your home games in St. Pete.
No, for sure. And of course, Tropicana Field is set up for television, purposes. And I think for any Blue Jays fan right now, or any fan of major league teams, it doesn't matter where they play. We just want, baseball back on our television screens because it'll just be a way to boost morale given everyone going through the pandemic. But I want to shift gears. Yeah, but I want to shift gears, Bob, and talk about your career. And you're someone that's been in this business for so long. You attended journalism school at Arizona State. It's one of the top journalism programs in the United States. I'm curious what that experience was like and how that shaped your passion for covering sports.
Well, I was just you worked at the high school newspaper, just like sports in general. You always liked it growing up, sort of thing. And so, always read all the box scores every morning and read all the sports stories. It It's like wasn't particularly just baseball, but whatever season it was. I was a football fan during fall, basketball fan during the winter, baseball summer, that sort of thing. So yeah, just enjoy sports, and then they worked a little bit in the college newspaper. And nothing beats experience or just the fact just writing itself. And then then went to Kansas City Star, and was kind of a tutor by Tracy Ringlesby, who's is the Spink Award winner of the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I began covering baseball with him. He kind of taught me the ins and outs more than anybody by far. And then worked there covering the Kansas City Royals. Then went to Los Angeles Times in mid-1989, covered the San Diego Padres, and then the Angels, then the Dodgers, before moving on to USA Today in 1998.
Do you remember your first game covering baseball as a member of the media?
I remember the first baseball scout I talked to when I was at the school newspaper was a guy named Scott Reed, who's right now with the Detroit Tigers, and he was with Dave Dombrowski, for a lot of different places. So he was the first baseball scout I talked to. Professional baseball would have been the Phoenix Giants, which is a AAA franchise at the time for the San Francisco Giants. And the first major league games obviously were with the Kansas City Royals.
And you said you had a few different stops before going to the USA Today, Kansas City Star, LA Times. And I'm just curious, Bob, compared to someone starting out today as a beat reporter or a beat writer, is it more challenging today to form those relationships with players, coaches, executives, given the advent of social media and technology? Or was it harder back then just because the communication wasn't as good or as efficient as it is today?
No, much easier back then, Lucas, much easier. For instance, covering, baseball, did 1 year in the NBA. I mean, you travel with the team a lot of times. After games, you'd be at the same nightclubs with them, having, drinks together. You see them on the road and have lunch together, that sort of thing. Now you don't see that. There's much more of a separate thing. Before, there wasn't clubhouse restrictions. Clubhouse is open 24/7. So you're in there, early afternoon, hanging out with the guys, getting to know them very, very well. And then after games, you write your story. Then you go back to the clubhouse, and guys are still hanging out. And, you have a few beers with them before going home. So, yeah, much different than today.
And you speak of those clubhouse restrictions, and I'm assuming for you, once baseball comes back amidst this pandemic, like nothing, of course, is certain. But I know that before the league shut down, clubhouse access was limited in order for health and safety purposes. But I'm just curious for you how your job will change as a reporter when baseball comes back amidst the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, be major changes, Lucas, in the sense that clubhouse won't be open. For the rest of the year. I'd be shocked if it was. It may not be open beginning part of next year either. So it'll be interesting. First of all, we'll see if they even allow writers into the ballparks at the beginning. I would think they would to maybe one per media entity type of thing, but not going to clubhouse. They'd probably do press conferences, on a Zoom call or, maybe on the field where you stay back from the guy, that sort of thing. A little bit more like maybe like a mix zone they do in the international baseball competition. But you won't have those one-on-ones at all.
No, for sure. And when doing research, Bob, for this interview, I see your poster of Bo Jackson's jersey hanging up in your background. He's someone that you looked up to, and I'm just curious why he was someone that you looked up to.
He was just a fascinating guy, Lucas. So yeah, that's Bo Jackson's Auburn jersey from his college days. But yeah, when I was coming to the Royals, he came up and we got very close, and a trust was developed very quickly with Bo. And just a fascinating guy. The fact he would give up his football career and go to baseball. everybody's kind of talking about Michael Jordan going to baseball, and he decided to choose baseball, and very good at it. Maybe All-Star game one year, but just a fascinating guy. Just growing up like he did, having no money at all in Bessemer, Alabama, and then becoming who he did. If it wasn't for Nike and all the endorsement money, I'm sure he would have just stayed with baseball. But very, very hard to pass it up. And then I still remember it was in Toronto right before the All-Star break, and he told me, "Hey, I'm going to do this football thing. I'm going to play football when the season's over." And we're at old Exhibition Stadium there, and the Royals players are furious. Like, how is baseball going to allow this? We're not even allowed to, do anything. We go bull riding now and stuff like that. So we're kind of making fun of it at the time.
You mentioned Exhibition Stadium, and for some of my listeners, that's where the Blue Jays started their franchise. It was very cold from what I hear from former writers and players. But I'm just curious if you have any memories of coming up to Toronto and covering the Blue Jays during your career.
Yeah, just a great place. I mean, as a writer, you love going to Toronto. You love going to Montreal. It was just now Toronto had this thing. I don't know if they still have it, Lucas. It's called a Polo Factory. And so everybody would buy a ton of shirts and pants and everything every time they went up there. The guy would let us in there, and the prices were dirt cheap and stuff. And your only worry was, getting it up through customs, that sort of thing. But yeah, just people very, very friendly. And I remember how dressed up everybody was. When you saw people, the Toronto writers, everybody's wearing suits or at least a sport jacket, that sort of thing. And, walking in the streets, everybody was dressed up. So yeah, just a great, still a great place, obviously. But yeah, those were my first impressions and still are.
No, it is a great place. And of course, the Blue Jays back-to-back World Series champions in 92 and 93. We had some playoff success in 2015 and 16, but hoping to get back there soon with this younger core of players. But I want to get back, Bob. You were talking about building a relationship with Bo Jackson, and I find that a lot of younger journalists today, once they get on a beat, they are so sometimes they're walking on eggshells because they want to remain objective, but that might cost you in terms of building a relationship with a player. I'm just curious if you have any advice for young, beat reporters and journalists, covering a sport like baseball in terms of building those relationships, because we talked about earlier how it was much easier back then than it is today, but it's still equally as vital in order to, write your stories.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing, Lucas, is just being very objective. I remember Tracy Ringlesby and Bob Elliott, of course, the Hall of Fame writer from Toronto, saying, whatever you do, if someone makes an error to lose a game or something like that, just objectively write it. Don't say, hey, in a kindergarten, kid could have made this play, or how could a guy blow this lead? Hey, things happen. You almost treat a guy like it's your neighbor, like, hey, he goes as bad as anybody else, and you write that way. And hey, if you have to be critical, you're there the next day in that clubhouse, even if it's your off day. You got to be sure you're there. That way, if he has any problem with anything, he can address it with you right there. And I think players realize, that as long as you're objective and fair, they can live with that. They know when they have a poor performance, and they know you have a job to do, and you got to write about it.
No, for sure. And I want to shift gears to a couple of, significant moments that you've covered in your career. And the first being the 2001 World Series between the Diamondbacks and the Yankees. And for those of you who don't know, this is a memorable 7-game series. The Diamondbacks beating the Yankees. Luis Gonzalez's bloop single to walk off in Game 7 off of Mariano Rivera. But in the backdrop of this World Series, of course, was 9/11 happening a few months earlier. And I'm just curious, Bob, as a writer and a reporter, how do you balance covering a World Series, which was, had a lot of memorable moments, with the context of a national tragedy like 9/11 that just happened a couple months before?
Yeah, the thing with 9/11, people forget is, hey, baseball was only shut down for a week. Nothing like that pandemic now. So then everybody was back in action. I happened to be in San Diego at the time. I had flown in to do a piece on Tony Gwynn. And Tony Gwynn going for 400. And of course, the thing 9/11 happened on a Monday. And so went to Tony Gwynn's house a couple of days later. He was such a nice guy, and did the piece. And then, of course, the backdrop of that. And then I covered a ton of San Francisco Giants games because Bonds was breaking the home run record. But yeah, there came playoff times, World Series, particularly with the Yankees involved. It was always in the back of people's minds, but not in the forefront. It was like, hey, okay, everybody wants to win this World Series championship, and even though the Diamondbacks won in 7 games, really they should have won that thing in 4 games.
Mm-hmm.
Collapsed by the closer there, Kim, Byung Kim, and or else that it would have been done in 4 or 5 games. But those comebacks made it a very thrilling World Series. And Game 6 was terrible. I think it was 15-0, a blowout. And then, of course, the epic Game 7.
Do you think, Bob, similar to 2001, that baseball today can serve as a morale booster when it comes back during this pandemic?
Oh, I do, Lucas. I think it's back to normalcy. And I think that's why baseball owners and players said, hey, we don't want to just play our baseball games in Florida and Arizona. We want to be back at our ballparks. So when fans back home, when they watch the games, and they can say, oh yeah, that's the dimensions I'm used to. There's Yankee Stadium. There's the scoreboard and everything else. So yeah, I think that's why it's important for them to be back at their home ballparks. It'll still mean a lot. I get asked a lot on radio and TV, say, well, would this season have an asterisk? Would this mean as much? And you talk to baseball players and particularly managers, they say, you know what, it'll mean more than a regular season, just because of what everybody's been through. You go to spring training, you stop, uncertainty, when it starts up again, if it starts up again. So it's going to be a challenging year for everybody. But I think that the World Series championship will mean as much as any other season, in many cases even more.
Definitely agree. And another moment that you've covered, Bob, is that I wanted to talk about was the 2016 World Series. And of course, that's when the Chicago Cubs exercised the curse of the Billy Goat, winning in 7 games, another classic Game 7. I know as, a writer, and sometimes beat reporters, they write 2 different stories. And I imagine for so many, writers in that game, they're like, okay, the Cubs are going to win, but then Rajay Davis's tying home run, and all of a sudden you might be scrambling to write about Cleveland winning the World Series. So I'm curious for you as a reporter there, is there more gravity just for that moment, just because of how much that moment meant to so many fans in both cities, depending on the outcome?
Yeah, no, great question, Lucas. That was a case where, Cleveland was in command of that World Series, the 3 games that won, and then they, then boom, the Cubs came roaring back there. And then, that game, the Cubs had it well in hand the whole time. Never once during that game did you think the Cubs were going to lose until Rajay Davis's home run. And there was like a gasp in the press box, because people probably had about 75% of the story written. Like, okay, here's the end of the curse and everything else. And boom, that happens. It reminds me a lot of the 86 World Series where Boston, had the 2-run lead, 2 outs, nobody on, and they, blow it against the New York Mets, very similar. So, and then, so then you write 2 different stories, 2 different leads. And the big question was, if Cleveland had won that World Series game, would people have been writing about the Indians winning the World Series or about the Cubs choking and blowing that game? I probably would try to go, right down the middle with that, mix and match. But I bet, I think more people might have been more interested in reading about the Cubs losing than the Indians actually winning.
And of course, there was that rain delay too, Bob, which added a lot of, drama as well. And then, and for me, I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen the Boston Red Sox and exercise the curse of the Bambino, and now the Cubs. It's just, it's fascinating. It just speaks to baseball's history that they have, that those curses still existed, and finally they were able to be exercised. And it just meant so much, I'm sure, to those cities that were involved.
Yeah, I mean, people forget how long it's been, for the Cleveland Indians, and
Of course.
yeah, like over 60 years. And then they, almost like, like you said, with the Red Sox stuff, I mean, now the Indians have the longest curse. Cleveland Browns, if they ever won a Super Bowl, people would go crazy, just like in Chicago with the Cubs. But yeah, I mean, the whole winter talk would have been dissecting Joe Maddon's moves. Is Joe Maddon going to get fired? What happens? And it would have been a miserable, miserable winter in Chicago instead of a great celebration. Yeah, the one thing, too, I kind of feel bad about is like when the Cubs win the World Series, people said, the first World Series, since, 1908, forgetting, hey, the White Sox won the World Series in 2005, different franchises, at least a city one.
No, for sure. And when you list those teams, like the Browns having not won a Super Bowl, it reminds me of the Toronto Maple Leafs in hockey are the longest curse. They haven't won since 1967. And I can imagine when they win, the city will shut down for weeks. But Bob, I want to end things off, just talking about, obviously this pandemic has hit hard for a lot of industries, the sports media industry included. And I'm just curious for you, can a young person who's passionate about baseball and sports have a career in journalism today? Because while I do think that the way news, is disseminated has changed, the demand for news is still going to be there. And but I want to hear your thoughts as someone, who has been in the business for so long and has seen, the industry change. But I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, there's certainly still a strong thirst for news, like negotiations that's going to happen between baseball and the players and the owners, as far as the economics, the health issues, everything else. People still have a passion for that, and they still, love the sport. I think the sport's been ripped apart so much over the years. You kind of want, declining attendance. Like, oh man, do people care about baseball? Well, they do, because also people are talking about when's baseball coming back. When I write stories, tremendous interest as far as if I talk about the possibility of when it's coming back. No matter who writes those stories, people want to read them. So yeah, it's going to be a scary time for up and coming journalists. Talk to my son about that all the time. So he's a beat writer covering the Cincinnati Reds for the Cincinnati Enquirer. You started doing that, and the industry, people are having furloughs, a lot of layoffs. It's a whole different world, but someone's got to provide that content. And I still think that, the best reporters and the best writers will still succeed in the business, but it's trying times for sure. And a lot of jobs have been cut out. I think, the best jobs now for job security is to be a beat writer. If you're a columnist or feature writer, for sure.
No, for sure. Bob Nightengale, he is a USA Today baseball columnist and an MLB Network insider. Bob, thank you so much for joining me today on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
My pleasure, Lucas. It was a pleasure.